Mercer on Mission is a program that challenges students to travel to developing nations to participate in various service projects. The 2014 Mercer on Mission to Ecuador focused on environmental contamination and human exposure to mercury due to artisanal and small-scale gold mining in the El Oro province. One of the things we encountered when going to a different country was a different language, both written and spoken. While in Ecuador, we got a lot of practice with our Spanish. My personal background in Spanish started in the 7th grade. I took Spanish for 2 years in middle school and then 2 additional years in high school. When I came to Mercer, I began taking intermediate Spanish courses during my freshman year. I have taken a Spanish class every semester, so I have had continuous practice with the language. Last summer, I went to Honduras and got to act as a translator, so I got even more practice with my Spanish then. Coming to Ecuador, I did not realize how much my Spanish skills were going to come into play. Our group of 9 people contained only 2 of us that could really speak the language. However, there were some people that were able to understand bits and pieces, but as a whole, we were not completely proficient in the language. Knowing that I was going to be the main translator was a little concerning initially, but I was quickly thrown into the language and had no choice but to adapt. The dialect in Ecuador was not as difficult for me to understand as I thought it would be. They did use some words I was not familiar with, but I was able to understand mostly everything. After spending 3 weeks in Ecuador, I was able to learn and adapt to their way of speaking. I used my Spanish in every aspect of the trip. When we first arrived in the country, I had to communicate with the taxi drivers in order to get us to the hotel. For the remainder of the trip, I was able to speak with the taxi drivers and give them directions to where we needed to go. Some of the taxi arrangements were made over the phone, so I had to really test my understanding when I was speaking to someone that I was not standing in front of. Next, I spoke with the hotel receptionist in order to confirm our reservations. Once we got settled into our hotels, we began to familiarize ourselves with the town. One of the more difficult applications of my Spanish was in the restaurants. I was not familiar with the typical dishes around Ecuador, so I did not often know what the food options were. We learned about words like chaulafán, tigrillo, churrasco, and naranjilla. After eating at a few places, I learned certain words so I was better able to understand the menus. One word that I quickly learned to use was factura, which means receipt. We needed to keep records of all of our purchases, so I made sure to learn this word early on. The most important part of my Spanish use was at the processing centers. When we first entered the centers, we always spoke with the plant owners to tell them about who we were and what we were doing. I formulated a little introduction speech in my head and used it almost every time we met new people. In some of the plants, the owners gave us tours and outlined every step of the process. This part really required a detailed use of the language because the processes were often very complex. At the beginning of the trip, I was a little nervous about having to translate all of the steps because I knew very little about the process in English. Luckily, the plant owners were very cooperative and took the time to explain each part slowly and clearly. Knowing the language was really helpful here because I was able to learn everything firsthand. In addition to this, we spoke with the miners in the plants. I had to put my Spanish skills to the test when I was responsible for conducting surveys and interviews with the miners. This required me not only to be able to read questions out loud, but also to understand and translate their responses. Without a solid grasp of the language, it would have been very difficult for me to successfully conduct the interviews. After we left the plants, we walked around the town and visited different gold shops. Speaking with the owners gave us insight into what they did and what they thought of their businesses. Speaking Spanish was useful because it allowed me to become friends with the owners so they would trust us and allow us to work with them. Finally, one of the biggest tests of my skills was while giving a presentation to the plant owners. This presentation was a way for us to summarize our research for the time we were there. We needed to share with the owners what we learned about the mercury levels and what we were intending to do with the information we gathered, so this presentation was very important for us. Clear communication and use of the Spanish language was a big part of our success in the trip. Over the course of the trip, I think my Spanish skills improved greatly. I was really nervous about being a translator and I was not sure that I would be able to do it effectively, but I was able to pull through in the end. Towards the end of the trip, even all of the students were making efforts to speak with the local people, even if it required a lot of hand gestures and acting things out. The importance of language as a whole is immense. Knowing Spanish is something I really value and I think will help me a lot in the future as a health professional. Traveling to Ecuador with Mercer on Mission was a great way to improve my skills and give me a practical implementation of the language.